We are back. There we go, on MorningLine on this Thursday. And we're taking your phone call, 737-7587, if you want to join in. We're just questions about politics, or more likely a comment that you may have. Professor John Vile is with us from MTSU Political Science. We'll go next to Charles. Charles, good morning. Hi, Charles.
Hey, how you doing this morning?
Good. What's on your mind?
Yeah, well, I just want to comment about our president. The average American that support him don't realize that they've been conned, and it's hard for them to really to admit that they've been conned. When you get conned, that's something that they don't want to admit, but it's clear that they've been conned, and everything he said or tried to do is a game for his benefit. But the guy is a liar and a racist, and we all see that. So why are we not admitting?
Okay, you know what, just big picture here politically, the psychology of a voter. And I'm picking it up, whether you're talking about President Trump or President Obama, or you're talking about someone in some of these local races, I do find the psychology of voters is such that it's rare to me that I find an individual that voted for someone at whatever level, and that someone does something that, pretty much everyone can agree not good. This guy or this woman didn't deliver the way they should have. And yet that voter is going to refuse to admit that they made a mistake, or maybe even refuse to admit that this time around I'm not going to vote. They still stick with them. It's almost like, well, if I go the other way, it's kind of admitting that I was wrong the first time, so I'm not going to change it, even though in the long run I know that person shouldn't be reelected. I'll be real curious to see whether or not at the state level Glenn Cassida gets reelected out of Williamson County. If he gets reelected, that will just further bolster it. That will baffle me. Absolutely baffle me if he gets reelected after all he's been through.
There's something called selective perception.
Yeah.
And often it's filtered through political parties. So Republicans are naturally inclined to support Republican candidates, and Democrats the same. There's probably we need a healthy skepticism of both. They used to claim, how can you tell a politician is lying? And it's when his lips are moving. So
Sure.
A little bit of, probably very few candidates other maybe than James Polk and perhaps George Washington kept all their campaign promises.
Yeah.
But
well, it's like voters have a blind spot, and voting for many people can be very personal, and I think it should be. And you associate and you get to know these candidates and you believe in them at one point, but then when maybe they don't live up to it, and especially I understand you vote party a lot of the time, and regardless, but at the same time sometimes there's other candidates within that party you could look at, and yet the blind spot comes when there's these negative things, and it's almost as though they just don't see those, and all they focus on and they refuse to acknowledge it. And I think it's more about them than the candidate, them not wanting to almost kind of say, gee, maybe I made a mistake, which no one's calling them out on it, but they just refuse to see that.
It's a little bit like family.
Yeah, maybe like family.
You sort of accept some of the things that go on that you would not if you were looking in from the outside.
Right. Okay, and again, I think that exists in both parties, both sides, but it's frustrating to me. I can think of myself times, when I voted and recognized that the individual I voted for did not live up to what I had hoped for, and I have no problems changing my mind. I don't announce it to everyone, and maybe the people don't say it, but then I'll go and I'll vote a different way. And I just don't understand that psychology for people.
Sometimes what will happen is people who voted, they won't go vote for the opponent, but they'll stay home. And so you could see some of that, either way here, but people who voted for Trump before are not quite as excited about him this time.
Yeah, and that may happen, and like I said, it may have happened with President Obama,
Sure.
It may have happened with President Bush, and sometimes, more likely to stay home, because in that way, they can't bring themselves maybe to vote for that other party,
Right.
okay? but they can. And then I also know for some voters, they may not like what an individual candidate really did. They'll do something to upset them. But the party platform, for instance, if you are pro-life
Sure.
as opposed to pro-choice, then you're going to pretty much lean toward the Republican
Sure.
Party in a lot of cases.
Sure.
And regardless of what other crap that candidate may do, you're going to vote that way. Or on the other side, what other crap the Democrat does, you're going to vote because you're pro-choice. Maybe it's a single issue for a lot of people.
The last election was, for many people, sort of a lesser of two evils. And the problem, of course, talking about our next election is we don't yet know what the other evil or the other candidate will be.
Yeah.
And a lot will depend on that.
Let's go to Roy. Roy, good morning. Hi, Roy.
Yeah, I got 3 questions if I can remember them all. One of them is, why do we even have 2 parties, Republican and Democrat? Why don't we have just the American Party and save all that money that they're spending on these politicians in the different parties to have the different referendums and the different votes and stuff, and join together as just one America? And just call ourselves Americans and elect the best man. Then my other question is, why don't we have term limits? Put term limits, and that would, in my opinion, would make politicians more honest, because they know they wasn't going to be in office but for 2 years before they was going to have to run for office again, and couldn't run but twice. 4 years would be the longest that they could run. That would allow all Americans to have a chance to get elected to office, if not all, but it would allow more Americans to get elected for public office, more citizens. And it would make your government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not of the politicians, by the politicians, and for the politicians. And my other question, I don't forgot what it was. So
well, those are 2 good ones.
He warned us that might happen.
That's all right. Those are 2 good ones that you have there, Roy. As far as the 2-party system, it's what we've had. We've had the thought of an independent party maybe emerge, but what about just no parties and just people just running, as sometimes they do in nonpartisan races, sure. in local elections?
It's fascinating because many of the early founders, now, they thought there would be factions, sort of individual interests, but many of them really did. They were surprised when parties developed. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists both looked suspiciously at each other, much as Roy mentioned, why can't we all be Americans? Mm-hmm. We had a brief period right after, sort of between James Madison and James Monroe, where parties seemed to die out, but quickly resurrected. And if you look at one-party states or no-party states, they tend to be totalitarian. They tend to be, somebody in a party headquarters somewhere tells you who you're going to vote for, and you do that. So parties, we do have differences in ideology, and it seems to reflect that. As to the term limits, we do, of course, have term limits for president. Mm-hmm. This was discussed at, early in America. And it was actually Alexander Hamilton who opposed term limits initially, because he said, well, if somebody's in there for only one term, first, they don't worry about their legacy as much, and maybe they'll just try to grab all they can while they're there. Mm-hmm. If you have the incentive for re-election, hopefully that will be an incentive to work for the public good. But as we've discussed, name recognition, financing, and some other factors have perhaps made that argument not quite as strong as it once was.
Was there a time when Speaker Foley and others, were they looking at term limits for Congress?
It's been a frequent topic of proposed constitutional amendments. Yeah. A couple states have it. In California, your legislators have term limits. It doesn't seem to have brought about the reforms that many people expected.
Okay. Well, we have term limits for mayors here.
Yeah.
How's that work?
And governor.
And governor, of course. As far as one other thing about just all Americans, it's been brought up again, and again, it requires changing the Constitution, which is very, very difficult. But the whole concept of the Electoral College, we've talked about this before. Now, we know President Trump won the Electoral College. He lost the popular vote. Okay?
As did George Bush in 2000.
Yeah, and so the Electoral College can, the argument for it that to me kind of resonates a bit is that it can even the playing field to some degree for some of these very small states and give them a little more say in the national stage. But then the other side of me says, you know what, the big picture should just be one person, one vote. I don't care where you live. It's just who gets more votes wins. That's discussed, do you ever think it gets any tread?
Well, again, I believe that it is the most frequently proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and of course we've had a change or two after the election. We used to cast, each elector would cast 2 ballots, and whoever got the first would be president and the other would be vice president. So you'd end up with a president from one party sometimes and a vice president from the other, and that was corrected by the 12th Amendment. We've made an addition, so Washington D.C. has 3 votes, but the fundamental structure remains. And it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify, and many of the states that would have to ratify popular election are gaining under the current electoral system.
Yeah, they're small, and they recognize why. And I understand wanting to have states all have equal say to some degree,
Sure.
All right, it gets brought up again and again, but never goes anywhere. Let's talk about the Democrats just a little bit here.
Okay.
It seems as though their field is shrinking.
Yeah, only 10.
Only 10 now, and who knows? It's not too late for someone else maybe out there to jump in.
No,
is it?
that's right. No,
I mean, it could happen. There could be other.
No, that's right. And actually, there are more candidates. There are like
10.
20 candidates.
Yeah.
There are 10 that have qualified for the debate.
For this next debate.
And they've done that on the basis of a series of polls and the number of contributors that they have. So that could change. And of course, we have, there are 2 candidates now who are challenging Trump on the Republican side. Neither of them, in my judgment, is a particular heavyweight, although Weld of Massachusetts, was a former governor. But is more identified with the Libertarian Party than he is the Republican Party.
All right, so the fact that, how much does it have to get whittled down as we get closer to, when do you think we'll really start seeing someone emerge as the front runner? As you look at the Democrats right now, still in terms of, primarily in my opinion, not because of his performance to this point, but just name recognition, is Joe Biden, okay? So you figured, everyone said, well, Joe Biden's leading the poll. Well, that's because everyone knows his name and he's been around. I'm not convinced that he would be the best candidate for the Democrats, but he's leading the way. At what point, and I think back to some of these other races like where Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, if you want to go back, where, just out of the blue, finally, someone gets traction and then came to the top, and at the beginning no one predicted it.
It looked that way for Kamala Harris after the first debate. She had a little bit of a surge. She doesn't seem to be there now.
What's it going to take?
One of the tricky things about the nomination process is Republicans generally are, well, not generally, Republicans are more conservative than the population at large, and the more Democratic you are, the more liberal you tend to be. And sometimes the person who's best able to get the nomination of the party is not as likely to win the general election. And this, in my judgment, somebody like a Bernie Sanders would not have much of a chance of winning the presidency. Now, I didn't think, for a while, I didn't think Donald Trump did either, so I could well be wrong on this. But it's quite possible that the mechanics of the nomination process doesn't always produce the best candidate for the general election. I think Biden's strength is he is at least perceived to be much more moderate than some of his challengers, and that works pretty well in a general election. So what he's stressing is electability, but you sort of need, you need people to believe that you believe in something, and if it's just, I'm electable, and he, to some extent, in fairness to him, he has tried to make it a matter of character. He has a superior character. to Donald Trump, and that might work for him.
You know, it'll be interesting. I think where the separation does start is when the primaries kick in.
Yes.
And then that's when we'll start seeing, you get one candidate
and
the caucuses and gets on a roll a little bit for whatever reason, wins a couple, and there may be for no other reason. I mean, just maybe hit well in that one state, and then it starts the momentum, and then that's sometimes how it'll take off.
Yes.
The first caucuses coming up.
I don't know if it's December or February. I ought to know
it's
this.
still a few months off, is what I'm thinking. But that's when we'll really start seeing separation among the Democratic candidates. We'll take a break. When we come back, a few more of your phone calls, final segment, discussing things politics-wise at the national level right after this.
You spend any amount of time in the great outdoors, hunting or fishing, you need to watch Southern Woods and Waters on News Channel 5+. Join host Hugh McNaughton and our area's top sportsmen as they share their experience and knowledge. Southern Woods and Waters